Hi there, Chris from WhichEV, and today I'm going to be looking at the VW e-Golf. Now the model we've got in front of us can be found for around £32,500, that's including the government grant. Now if you want to check out the full length review on our website, make sure you check out in the link in the description below. Without further ado, let's get into this review. And now we're inside the vehicle, and let's talk about the finish and the design of the interior of the cabin. Now in terms of how it looks like, it's very much similar to your normal petrol variant Golf. There is a rubbery material all the way around the dashboard, and in terms of the trim around the door, it's kind of got a brushed aluminium look. There's nothing too special around here. If you compare it to some of its competitors, such as like the BMW i3, you'd find that the BMW i3 offers a slightly more premium feeling interior. Moving on to the steering wheel itself, I would say that the steering wheel is very easy to grip. It's not too large, it's not too small, which makes it feel too sporty. It's just the right size. It's very also easy to maneuver. So if you're going to be maneuvering around the city and or wanting to park, I found it very easy to control the wheel, which isn't the same thing that you might associate to other cars in its class. Now on the steering wheel there is a set of buttons. On the left hand side you've got your cruise control buttons and also volume, and then on the right hand side you've got voice control and also media controls as well to skip and previous song. I did find it a little bit limiting as there is no play and pause button directly on the steering wheel. Instead I had to revert to the infotainment system in order to play and pause my music. Now as for the voice control function of it, I did find it to be a little bit temperamental. It didn't always pick up my voice, even though I was speaking clearly and also whilst the car was completely off. In other words, there was no road noise or anything like that to interfere. Voice control is used in order for you to navigate, for example, or play a certain song or call a certain contact. And for me, I found it to be a little bit hit and miss in my tests. Now, moving on from here, we go into the instrument cluster, what's right in front of you as you are driving. Now, the instruments cluster can't be customized. On the left-hand side, you've got your power in terms of how much power you're generating and or you're recouping into the battery, and I'll touch on that in a little bit. You've also got your range, and in terms of the center part, you can also customize this part directly through the steering wheel in order for you to show your navigation or to show your range, or let's say what media is playing. On the right hand side there is your speedometer, so it gives you an indication of how fast you're actually going. Now let's move on to the infotainment system. Now the one I've got over here has got an 8-inch display. You can get an option of getting a 9.2-inch display as well, so it's worth bearing in mind that you can tailor that to your needs. Now in my case, I found that the touchscreen display is very responsive. The colors are very vivid. I had no issues whatsoever navigating. It's very simple. VW have integrated a left and right quick access buttons, for example, your navigation or let's say your phone, and by simple touch of a button, it quickly launches you into that part of the infotainment system. Now, better still, the infotainment system, unlike some other systems out there, supports CarPlay, MirrorLink, and Android Auto. In my tests, as I've got an Android smartphone, I found it to work flawlessly. You will need the right cable because some phones and slash infotainment systems are a little bit picky, but as long as you use the one that's included with your phone, you'll have no issues launching up your respective car sharing app. Now, if you don't want to use a certain system, you can also pair up your phone or let's say your passenger's phone via Bluetooth. It's very intuitive, very easy to do, and when you're paired up, you can control your songs and or media wirelessly. Now, before we move on from the infotainment system, I do want to quickly mention my audio settings. Now, the reason I mention that is because I'm a little bit of an audiophile and like listening to music, and in this respect, I had to EQ my sort of settings through the infotainment system. I had to lower the bass a little bit, increase the mids, and decrease the highs. The reason behind that is because out of the box, at least the stock sound system, which is included in the VW e-Golf, is a little bit prominent in the mid-bass tones and is a little bit sibilant on the highs. Therefore, I found it to be affecting the vocals, which is the mids, and therefore I had to boost them a little bit artificially. The overall sound quality is decent, it's nothing to shout about. However, if I compare it to other vehicles such as the BMW i3 or let's say the Mini Electric, I preferred the sound quality out of the box from those cars. Now we move on to the physical buttons, which I found just under the screen. Now these are just for temperature controls, so you can adjust the temperature within the cabin for the left hand or the right hand side, and also adjust the fact that if you want heated seats. Now that might be an option, so it's worth bearing in mind. Now just under that there's a little compartment which allows you to store your phone. I found myself finding a little bit awkward to store my Galaxy S10 Plus. It didn't fit in properly, so I had to fit it into a side, or else it would just slide around while I was driving. But on the plus side, there is a USB socket there which allows you to either connect it up via Android Auto, CarPlay or MirrorLink, drink, and or just charge your phone if you so wish. Moving down towards your arm, shall I say, you've got the gear selector. Now the gear selector is very intuitive, very easy to use, and has got a nice sort of grip to it. You will need to use this quite often, specifically if you want to use the regenerative braking methods. However, I'll get into that section in a little bit later. Now, as we move down from the center console, you've got the parking brake, which is an e-brake, as you might again expect from an electric vehicle, and you've also got an auto hold function. Now, the auto hold function is actually quite useful. It prevents the car from rolling backwards. This might seem very simple and very obvious to some people. However, not all cars have that feature. So it's nice to see that the VW e-Golf has it included. You've also got 2 cup holder spaces, which are just useful for putting in, let's say, your coffee mug, and there's also a space for putting a loose change. There's a 12-volt socket there as well if you want to plug in a cigarette lighter and then therefore charge another device. And then within the center console compartment, there's a small amount of storage to put, let's say, your sunglasses or a very small water bottle. Now, I would say the limitations of the storage capacity is that there is no USB socket or 12-volt socket in there. So you can't pop in a secondary phone or, let's say, a tablet, or it wouldn't fit anyway. But if you wanted to put a phone there or have your passenger charge via that, then you won't be able to. Now let's talk about space. There's quite a lot of room at the back. I'm just under 6 foot and I've got about a hand of space just above my head. The same could be said at the front for the driver or the front side passenger. In terms of legroom, again, I've got a lot of room. I don't feel uncomfortable or feel cramped in the slightest. As for space, as in rather than the actual passenger as to where you can actually store your stuff and your belongings, I found myself not having any problems in terms of fitting a large luggage and or a small luggage. It is worth bearing in mind that if you come from the normal VW Golf, as in the petrol variant of it, you're going to be losing a little bit of capacity. 40 litres to be specific. You're dropping from around 380 litres down to 340 litres in the boot. However, with the rear seats lowered, this figure increases to over 1,200 litres, which, as you might be able to see, is plenty of space when it comes to storing larger type of goods. Now, elsewhere in terms of storage places, you've also got near the driver and the passenger a location where you can store your water bottle or, let's say, any other things over there. I had no issues putting in a 500 milliliter water bottle on the side of me whilst I was driving. And what about in terms of comfort? Well, the seats themselves are very soft. I have no issues whatsoever. They do not really hold you in properly when you are driving left and right, but that said, it is not a sports car, so it's worth bearing in mind. I will say that the rear seats are comfortable. They don't seem just too upright and uncomfortable to sit. And as I mentioned before, the legroom also does constitute a factor there when it comes to comfort. Now, finally, before we move on to the performance of the vehicle, it's worth bearing in mind the exterior design of the VW e-Golf. I really like what VW have done when the car first came out, and I must say that the design of the vehicle does put it ahead of, let's say, a Nissan Leaf. It looks a little bit more classy, a little bit more, not say sporty, but it does appeal to a wider audience. The VW e-Golf definitely is aesthetically pleasing from the exterior. So what about when it comes to performance? So right now I'm at a standstill and you might be able to hear, well, not hear, there's absolutely no noise when it comes to engine noise because we are talking about an electric vehicle. Now there is a little button over here on the left hand side of the gear selector which activates or deactivates the electric engine sounds. That is for the exterior, and it's very much present in other cars, let's say the Nissan Leaf, and essentially gives pedestrians the way of knowing that there's a car that's approaching. Now this mode is enabled by default each time you switch on the car. Even if you were to disable the function and switch off and then switch on the car, it will still be enabled. It's a little bit of a kind of tiresome thing that you constantly have to press it on or off depending on the mode you prefer. There's also driving modes. Now there's 3 driving modes to select from: normal, eco and eco plus. Now what I found is when I was driving in the city, I found myself using eco just because I wanted climate controls because eco plus reduces that. But then when I was driving on the motorway, I found myself reverting to normal. The reason why is essentially normal gives you the most amount of power from the vehicle, whilst the eco and eco plus reduce this from top speed to the actual responsiveness of the car. Now speaking of top speed, in normal mode you're going to hit around 93 miles per hour. 0 to 60 in just under 10 seconds. I think it's around 9.6 seconds on top of my head. And that means of a power around 100 kilowatts, which translates to around 135 horsepower. Now, yet again, when it came to those driving modes, I did find myself having to select that every single time I turned on the vehicle. I found it a little bit frustrating as to the fact that the vehicle wouldn't store the last used profile. So therefore, if I was driving in eco, switched off the car after doing a shop, and then switched on the car after coming back from the shop, I would have to re-enable that mode. Now, how about when it comes to actually driving? Now, the drivability of the car is very nice. And I must say, when it came to comparing it to the BMW i3, I much preferred driving the VW e-Golf in and around the city. And the reason behind that is because of its suspension. The suspension is a little less tough, and therefore when it comes to going over bumps, or at least speed bumps, it means that it's a little bit more comfortable. Now, in terms of drivability, in terms of performance and the handling characteristics, that all pretty much feeds into the same sort of area. It's very much a comfortable car to drive. And I would say, in comparison to something like the BMW i3, the VW e-Golf feels a lot more easier to handle and very much an easier adoption for people who haven't come across EVs before. It is essentially a VW Golf, but just made fully electric. And to me, that is a pretty good sign, because that's what VW has kind of been renowned for over so many years with its production of the Golf. I will say, however, due to it being a little more softer vehicle when it comes to driving around the city, it does seem to roll a little bit. And I even noticed this, if I were to just shake in the vehicle, the car would kind of wobble, and that was pretty obvious when I was in the vehicle. Now, the vehicle's batteries are in the floor of the vehicle, and therefore it does give it a little bit more stability and good center of gravity. Speaking about the batteries, they provide at around 120 odd miles of driving range. I think WLTP standards around 145 miles. Now, that isn't too bad when it comes to driving in and around the city or small little streets, but when you start doing longer journeys, you start to realize that that range can become a problem. Now, in terms of that being a problem, it is to say that in comparison to its competitors, the BMW i3, or let's say the Nissan Leaf, or other vehicles out there which are coming soon, even from VW with the ID.3, you do notice that that range is somewhat of a problem. Now, the driving range is something that causes, I would say, range anxiety for a lot of people, and the fact that the VW e-Golf doesn't really address that with around 125 miles is not say worrying, but I would say it's arguably its biggest flaw. Now, when it comes to charging the vehicle, it's pretty simple. You've got a Type 2 charger that you can use, and therefore if you were to plug it into a DC charger, you'd get around, in 45 minutes you'd get around 80%, and in around an hour it'll take you to charge to 100%, which isn't that bad. If you do, however, resort to an AC charger, which is ones that I had to use when it came to public chargers, I found myself having to use a 7.2 kilowatt charger, and therefore it takes over 5 hours to charge to full, which is very long indeed. Now, in terms of regenerative braking methods, you've got 4 options to choose from. You've got B mode, which is the most aggressive, D3, D2, D1, and it being completely off altogether. Now, having come from the BMW i3, I kind of got used to the pretty harsh regenerative braking that comes by default with the i3. I really like the fact that you get to tailor this and customize this to your own liking with the VW e-Golf. Now, the regenerative braking method I used the most was actually B mode, which is the most aggressive out of them all. Now, that is not to say that that's the most useful mode that you can use. However, it's purely subjective as to how much energy you want to recoup back into the battery. If you're on the motorway and you're used to coasting, I would probably suggest D2 or D3. However, if you are in terms of city driving like I am doing right now, then I would probably suggest B mode. It just recoups energy and almost allows you to have a single pedal approach. In other words, you no longer have to use the brake when you're using B mode. It does take a little bit getting used to, so I won't deny the fact that it's not for everyone. Now, in order to access that, you have to use the gear selector. Now, yet again here, I think VW have not say missed a trick, but it's something that I noticed. Very much like the mode and the engine sound, the fake engine sound that you get, you have to select it every single time you sit down. So let's say, for example, I really like to drive the car in B mode only. I had to every single time select that, because by default, when you switch on the car, it would be on regenerative braking methods off altogether, therefore you're having to use the brake. That's not to say using the brake doesn't recoup energy back into the battery. However, it does mean that if I do like using that B mode, I have to reselect it every single time from the gear selector. And that to me is a little bit of a flaw, specifically when it comes to using the car on a daily basis. So I found myself over a period of a week having to each time sit in the car and kind of get used to putting down to the gear selector in order to activate B mode, in order to recoup that energy the way I like it to do. So what do I make about the overall performance of the vehicle? Well, I would say it sits somewhat in between the Nissan Leaf and the BMW i3. It doesn't have that sporty feel and that nippy, drivability of the BMW i3, nor does it have that range of the Nissan Leaf. However, it does feel like it has a little bit of both worlds into one car. So you've got a little bit of that sporty type of nature if you want to use it in normal mode, and yet you've got that eco mode when you're using that regenerative braking methods, and or in terms of drivability and usability, you can have it that you have your kids sitting at the back, or you have luggage that you want to take, and you don't have to worry about adopting to a smaller sized vehicle or one that looks radically different from other cars on the road. So overall, would I recommend the car? Well, ultimately, it's somewhat of an awkward situation, because the VW e-Golf comes at a time after the VW ID.3 has been announced and is coming out next year. On top of that, you've got cars which compete currently in its class as the BMW i3 and the Nissan Leaf, which both provide compelling solutions if you want a car with longer driving range and or a sportier type of feel of a car. And then you've got this car which sits in between. So I would recommend the car if you do like the VW line and you do like the Golf design and you wouldn't see yourself driving a Nissan Leaf. Similarly, it's the same case when it comes to the BMW i3. If you don't want a sporty car that's a little bit hard in terms of suspension and isn't as kid-friendly, so to speak, then the VW e-Golf might be the better solution. So ultimately, my biggest complaint about the car, and I would say, not say my only complaint, my biggest complaint is the fact its range is limited. There are other aspects out there about the car which I'm not too fond of. For example, the lack of saving memory when it comes to using the different driving modes or the regenerative braking methods, and also the sound system, which is somewhat subpar in comparison to some of its competitors. However, everywhere else, I've really struggled to find some flaws with the car. So yes, I would recommend it, and I do think it's a decent electric car. However, it might be worth waiting for the VW ID.3, which might prove to be a slightly better all-electric car.